They used to talk about him as if he weren't there. Sometimes they spoke in lowered voices, sometimes openly, as though his presence didn't matter either way. He was the man who unlocked the gates every morning, swept the courtyard, and disappeared into the background before the real conversations began. His name was Elias, but over time, even that seemed unnecessary to most people in the house. The Whitmore estate was large, old, and proud, much like the family that lived in it. Generations of wealth had made them confident, loud, and impatient. They valued titles, appearances, and who sat at which table. Elias fit nowhere in that picture. He lived in a small room near the storage shed, ate after everyone else, and spoke only when spoken to. He did his work carefully, quietly, and without complaint. At family gatherings, relatives flew in from different cities, dressed sharply, smelling of expensive cologne and confidence. They would notice Elias carrying trays or adjusting chairs and ask, "Who's that?" The answer was always the same. Just staff. No one bothered to ask more. Elias would lower his gaze, offer a polite nod, and move on. But the oldest man in the house noticed everything. Arthur Whitmore had built much of the family's fortune himself. Long before the estate became a symbol of inherited status, it had been a dream sustained by long nights and hard decisions. Age had bent his back and slowed his steps, but his mind remained sharp, observant. And as the years passed, he began to see more clearly than ever who truly cared for him and who merely waited for what he would leave behind. Arthur's children visited often, but rarely stayed long. They talked about business, about returns and risks, about what should be done next. They spoke at him more than with him. When his health declined, discussions grew tense, about doctors, costs, and inconvenience. Everyone had an opinion, but no one had time. Elias did. He was the one who noticed when Arthur struggled to hold his teacup. He adjusted the handle without being asked. He learned which chair eased the old man's back and which window brought in the afternoon light Arthur liked. When Arthur repeated stories from his youth, stories everyone else had heard too many times, Elias listened as if each one were new. At night, when the house quieted and loneliness crept in, Elias sat nearby, reading softly or simply keeping watch. He learned the rhythms of Arthur's breathing, the signs of discomfort, the moments when silence was better than conversation. Over time, their exchanges grew easier, deeper. Arthur spoke of regrets, of friendships lost, of how success had cost him more than he once expected. Elias never offered advice. He never judged. He listened. One evening, during a rare storm, the power went out across the estate. The family complained loudly, calling for generators and blaming management. Arthur sat in the dark, uneasy. Elias lit a lamp and brought it to him, then sat beside the chair and spoke quietly about the sound of rain on tin roofs, about nights he remembered from his childhood. Arthur smiled. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him like that. As months passed, Arthur's health worsened. Hospital visits became frequent. Arguments followed each appointment, about treatment plans, about whether the effort was worth it. Elias attended every visit, standing to the side, absorbing instructions, remembering details others ignored. When Arthur returned home exhausted, it was Elias who helped him settle, who stayed awake in case the pain returned. The family noticed Elias only when something went wrong. A glass broken. A task unfinished. But Arthur noticed when everything went right. One afternoon, Arthur asked Elias about his life. It was a simple question, but it caught Elias off guard. He spoke carefully, unsure how much to share. He talked about growing up poor, about learning early how to work quietly, about moving from place to place without roots. Arthur listened intently, then said something that stayed with Elias long after. "You know," Arthur said, "people confuse importance with noise." Elias didn't reply. He didn't need to. When Arthur became bedridden, the house changed. Visitors came less frequently. Conversations became hushed, tense. The family began speaking openly about the future, sometimes forgetting Arthur could still hear them. Elias noticed the way Arthur's eyes closed during those moments, not from sleep, but from disappointment. One night, Arthur asked Elias to fetch some papers from his study. Elias hesitated. No one was allowed in there without permission, but Arthur insisted. Among the documents was an envelope, sealed, carefully labeled. Arthur asked Elias to bring it to the lawyer the next day. Elias didn't ask what it was. He simply nodded. Arthur passed away quietly a week later, early in the morning. Elias was the one who noticed first. He closed the old man's eyes and sat with him until the family arrived. Grief filled the house, but it was tangled with something else, anticipation, calculation. The air felt heavy with unspoken expectations. The funeral was grand. People spoke of Arthur's achievements, his legacy, his generosity. Elias stood at the back, unnoticed, listening as others praised a man they barely knew in his final years. Afterward, the family lingered, discussing what would happen next. Who would take the house, who would manage the accounts? Elias quietly packed Arthur's personal items, handling each one with care. He assumed his time there was ending. People like him didn't stay long after men like Arthur were gone. The reading of the will took place a few days later in the main sitting room. Everyone gathered, dressed formally, expressions controlled. Elias stood near the doorway, unsure if he should even be there. No one objected. They barely noticed him. The lawyer began reading. There were properties divided, funds allocated, donations mentioned. The family listened closely, reacting subtly when amounts were smaller than expected. Tension crept in. Murmurs spread. Then the lawyer reached the final section. Arthur's voice, preserved in written words, seemed to fill the room. He spoke of gratitude. Of clarity. Of understanding who had stood by him when there was nothing left to gain. The lawyer read Elias's name. At first, no one reacted. Then confusion rippled through the room. The lawyer continued, explaining that the primary residence, the remaining savings, and Arthur's personal effects were left to Elias. The silence that followed was absolute. Someone laughed nervously, assuming an error. Another protested loudly. Questions flew, accusations followed. Elias felt the room closing in around him. He wanted to leave, to disappear, to return to the quiet life he understood. The lawyer raised his hand and calmly stated that Arthur had been of sound mind. That his decision was deliberate and final. He produced handwritten notes, explanations, dates. Arthur had written that presence mattered more than blood. That kindness outweighed entitlement. That Elias had given him dignity when others gave him schedules. All eyes turned to Elias. He stepped forward slowly, heart pounding. He hadn't imagined this outcome. He hadn't wanted it. He thanked the lawyer quietly and looked at the family. Their faces showed shock, anger, regret, some perhaps for the first time understanding what they had overlooked. Elias spoke simply. He said he never stayed for inheritance or reward. He stayed because Arthur had been alone. Because listening cost nothing. Because respect should not depend on status. No one responded. In the days that followed, the house emptied. The family left, taking what little remained theirs. Elias walked through the rooms alone, each space heavy with memory. He didn't rush to change anything. He didn't celebrate. He sat in Arthur's chair one evening and watched the light fade, just as he had done countless times before, only now, no one expected him to leave. The world outside would soon learn his name. Papers would be signed. Lives would adjust. But in that quiet moment, Elias understood something deeply. He had never been a nobody. He had simply been unseen.